Hello, how are you everybody? I do hope you're well. It's a bit hard to tell these days what's going on. Anyway, so I see I didn't really get the changed location of the captions sorted, did I? Got it down so it wasn't quite cutting off the bottom of my chin, but not so much anyway. Let's see if I can get the camera to pick me up slightly differently and then whatever. So hopefully you can read the captions if you want. I'm guessing that you can turn them off if you don't want to use them. You should be able to, because I thought that was the sort of captions I was using. Anyway, doesn't really matter. So what are we up to? We've got really wet weather. Well, it was in the middle of the night. It's now just very damp and grey outside. And if you came here because you followed the link on my Instagram post, you will see just how grey it is outside. We can't even see the boats that are down in the bay properly. And we can't actually see the point very well. It's just a hint. It's like there's a ghost of a piece of land out there, and we definitely can't see the other side where the islands are. That's just because it's raining, but not raining at the moment. It's just damp. Like if you walk around out there, you're going to get wet. And hi, Talia, thanks for following me. That's wonderful. What are we up to? We've had the first reading of the new book, which is Rudyard Kipling's Rewards and Fairies, and we are going to carry on and have some more of that. I've even managed to be able to get some illustrations for it. There are only 4 in the book. Different illustrator, I suppose, different publisher maybe, and that's what they came up with. There is another edition which has illustrations by somebody else, but I haven't been able to find a copy to be able to share the pictures with you. That's just the way life is, unfortunately. And in case I don't know if you've noticed, but behind me at the moment, we have a different backdrop. The library behind me is the library or den where this story was probably written. This is the library at Batemans, which is the house that Rudyard Kipling lived in southern England for quite a number of years. And I've mentioned it before when I was reading Puck of Pook's Hill, across the bottom of the garden and through some fields past the old mill, which is actually in the stories. There's actually a hill off in the distance on the other side there, which is the hill referred to in the stories as Pook's Hill. And the story the current story has actually mentioned Pook Hill, yeah, that's one. And we've met Puck again a year later after the previous story. So we are going to get on with reading after I have told the visitors, the new people here, who I am. Hi, I'm Jev. I read old-fashioned children's stories, the ones that my parents and my grandparents all read when we were growing up. I read their books, and so I've loved actually learning about different parts of the world, different people, different ways of seeing and experiencing things. Most of the stories I read are English, just because those are the ones that I grew up with. There will be some other ones further on as we're reading that are Canadian, maybe American, what else? Australian. We've had one New Zealand one, which wasn't as good as the one that I wanted to read for you because I couldn't find the one I wanted to read at the time. But we will get there. We will find it, and we will actually eventually get to the place where I can read you exactly the stories I want because I have the copies out of storage, or I found them down at my parents' place or in boxes or something like that. Because that's some of what happens at the moment, is trying to find these books. If you've got suggestions about books that you think might be fun to read, just remember children's books and old-fashioned, ones that were written a long time ago. If you've got anything like that you'd like to suggest that we read, then join our Discord server and make a suggestion in the main chat channel there. I occasionally manage to get some of the illustrations from the different books that we've been reading up in a relevant channel for that book or that series of books. It doesn't happen very often, but if we get more people over there and they're chatting, we may actually get a bit more action where I actually put some pictures up there and things like that. Sometimes it feels like I'm just in an echo chamber talking to myself over there, so it's not quite as motivating for getting things done. But enough of all the yakking. I am going to get on with actually reading today's story with one last piece of information I need to give you. I have a suggestion for you. Make sure you have something to drink. I have water because it keeps me hydrated, which means that the brain works better and so does the voice. Something to eat, something to snack on, and a comfortable place to sit or stand or lie down or whatever it is that you do when you're listening. And I'm most happy if you want to be drawing, doing some work, studying, whatever, while I'm chatting to you in the background. That's fine by me. I've got friends who will often listen to me reading while they're going to sleep at night. So there you go, bedtime stories with Jev, or just story time. Do you remember being at primary school and sitting on the mat while the teacher was reading to you for story time? That's what it's like. It's not like audiobooks. Audiobooks are so perfect. That's not me. I don't read like that. I just can't. I make mistakes. I get lost halfway through a sentence even while I'm reading it. My brain will go sideways sometimes. Or I'll interrupt myself while I'm reading to explain something to you. That happens too. You'll learn about all sorts of things when you come here to listen to stories. Sometimes it's because of things I've seen and done myself, and sometimes it's because of things I've learnt about. Because I've had a lot of life experience, and you can tell, look at that grey hair. So, we shall carry on. We are reading Rewards and Fairies by Rudyard Kipling. This one doesn't have chapter numbers. It has poems and it has story chapters, and they're to do with either actual or mythological or even completely made up pieces of British history. Some of it actually travels, I think in this book, travels across to North America for part of the stories. We shall find out as we go through the book. So today's section starts, the section is called Gloriana, and the actual first poem we have is The Two Cousins, so I'll start there. The two cousins, valour and innocence, have latterly gone hence to certain death by certain shame attended. Envy are even to tears the fortune of their years, which though so few, yet so divinely ended. Scarce had they lifted up life's full and fiery cup, than they had set it down untouched before them. Before their day arose, they beckoned it to close, close in destruction and confusion o'er them. That's over them. They did not stay to ask what prize could crown their task, well sure that prize was such as no man strives for, but passed into eclipse, her kiss upon their lips, even Belphoebe's whom they gave their lives for. That's a name I've never heard before. That's the end of the poem. Belphoebe. Maybe you could look that up and see if there's a meaning for that name. It is a name. Belphoe, written together, overlapping. It's an old-fashioned letter style. Phoebe. So it's Phoebe, but with Bell at the beginning of it, but only one L in the Bell. And Bell usually means beautiful, I think. Anyway, so we'll carry on. Gloriana, which is the name of the next story section. Willow Shore, the little fenced wood where the hop poles are stacked like Indian wigwams, had been given to Dan and Una for their very own kingdom when they were quite small. So what we get in the story is sometimes a section will start with Kipling describing part of the farm or the surrounding countryside that the story is set in, and the connection with the children that the story is being told through, and then from there we will move into history or some historic mythology or something of Kipling's own making. There are some of the characters in this book that are real people, were real people, long gone. And then there are other ones which are set in specific historic periods, and the historic period was real, but the characters he's talking about are made up, but they're used to illustrate a time period. And also, don't forget, these are old-fashioned stories based out of the culture at the time when they were being written. And so there will be some of the attitudes that are portrayed within the story that are not our own attitudes, are not the way we believe that people should be spoken to, spoken of, treated, and things like that. But that was acceptable at the time, either of the writing or when he's expressing part of the story even earlier back than when it was written. So I shall carry on and stop explaining. Willow Shore, the little fenced wood where the hop poles are stacked like Indian wigwams, had been given to Dan and Una for their very own kingdom when they were quite small. As they grew older, they contrived to keep it most particularly private. That makes sense. Even Phillips, the gardener, told them every time he came in to take a hop pole for his beans, and old Hobden would no more have thought of setting his rabbit wires there without leave, given fresh each spring, than he would have torn down the calico and marking ink notice on the big willow that said grown-ups not allowed in the kingdom unless brought. So the adults around this area actually respected the fact that this was the children's own space, which is lovely. Now you can understand their indignation when one blowy July afternoon, that would be in summer for them, as they were going up for a potato roast, they saw somebody moving among the trees. They hurled themselves over the gate, dropping half the potatoes, and while they were picking them up, Puck came out of a wigwam. "Oh, it's you, is it?" said Una. "We thought it was people." "I saw you were angry from your legs," he answered with a grin. "Well, it's our own kingdom, not counting you, of course. That's rather why I came. A lady here wants to see you." "What about?" said Dan cautiously. "Oh, just kingdoms and things. She knows about kingdoms." There was a lady near the fence, dressed in a long, dark cloak that hid everything except her high, red-heeled shoes. Her face was half covered by a black silk-fringed mask without goggles, and yet she did not look in the least as if she motored, because that was when people in the children's time period, which is around 1910, very, very, very early vintage car, early motor cars, what we would now call vintage cars, and even older. And so you wore a mask with goggles, maybe a scarf instead of a mask, when you were motoring to keep the dust and the bugs off your face. So that was what that references to, and yet she did not look in the least as if she motored. Puck led them up to her and bowed solemnly. Una made the best dancing lesson curtsy she could remember. The lady answered with a long, deep, slow, billowy one. Someone who knows how to curtsy. "Since it seems that you are a queen of this kingdom," she said, "I can do no less than acknowledge your sovereignty." She turned sharply on staring Dan. "What is in your head, lad? Manners?" "I was thinking how wonderfully you did that curtsy," he answered. She laughed a rather shrill laugh. "You're a courtier already. Do you know anything of dances, wench, or queen, must I say?" "I've had some lessons, but I can't really dance a bit," said Una. "You should learn then." The lady moved forward as though she would teach her at once. "It gives a woman alone among men or her enemies time to think how she shall win or lose. A woman can only work in man's playtime. Hey-ho!" She sat down on the bank. Old Middenborough, the lawn-mower pony, stumped across the paddock and hung his sorrowful head over the fence. "A pleasant kingdom," said the lady, looking round, "well enclosed, and how does your majesty govern it? Who is your minister?" Una did not quite understand. "We don't play that," she said. "Play?" The lady threw up her hands and laughed. "We have it for our own together," said Dan, explaining. "And you never quarrel, young Burley?" "Sometimes, but then we don't tell." The lady nodded. I've no brats of my own, but I understand keeping a secret between queens and their ministers. Ay de me, but with no disrespect to present majesty, methinks your realm is small and therefore likely to be coveted by man and beast. For example, she pointed to Middenborough, yonder old horse with the face of a Spanish friar. Does he never break in? He can't. Old Hobden stops all our gaps for us, said Una, and we let Hobden catch rabbits in the shore. The lady laughed like a man. I see. Hobden catches conies, rabbits, for himself and guards your defences for you. Does he make a profit out of his coney catching? We never ask, said Una. Hobden's a particular friend of ours. Hoity-toity, the lady began angrily. Then she laughed. But I forget. It is your kingdom. I knew a maid once that had a larger one than this to defend, and so long as her men kept the fences stopped, she asked him no questions either. Was she trying to grow flowers? Asked Una. No, trees, perdurable trees. Her flowers all withered. The lady leaned her head on her hand. Now, there's a word I don't know, and I'm going to write it down, and possibly I will remember to look it up and put it over in our chat on Discord. Perdurable. P-E-R-D-U-R-A-B-L-E. There you go. Perdurable. Her flowers all withered. The lady leaned her head on her hand. They do if you don't look after them. We've got a few. Would you like to see? I'll fetch you some. Una ran off to the rank grass, that means long and not under control, not just left to grow, unmown. Rank grass, finding it in the shade behind the wigwam, and came back with a handful of red flowers. Aren't they pretty? She said. They're Virginia stock. Said Una. Virginia, said the lady, and lifted them to the fringe of her mask. Yes, they come from Virginia. Did your maid ever plant any? Not herself, but her men had ventured all over the earth to pluck or to plant flowers for her crown. They judged her worthy of them. I think that the lady is talking with word pictures. I don't think she means actual flowers. What do you think? I'm trying to find where I was on the page. As I said before, I get lost. They judged her worthy of them. And was she? Asked Dan cheerfully. Quien sabe? Which means who knows. But at least while her men toiled abroad, she toiled in England, that they might find a safe home to come back to. And what was she called? Said Dan. Gloriana, Belle Phoebe, Elizabeth of England. Her voice changed at each word. You mean Queen Bess? The lady bowed her head a little towards Dan. So Dan is of the era when there were some, probably because of the poetry that they learned at school that was to do with learning history, there were some nicknames for some of the royalty that people learned about as a way of remembering people. So Queen Bess was Queen Elizabeth I. There you go. And there's another one. I can't remember her name, but she comes up in some of my detective stories that I read for myself. In the Middle Ages, she's even earlier. And she had a fight with her cousin because she believed that England was her kingdom and he believed it was his kingdom. And it was after William the Conqueror, and they were both related to William, also known as several other names, but I'm not going to use them here because some of them are inappropriate for children, in case there are children listening to the stories. Anyway, so we shall carry on. I wish I could remember. Queen Maude was her nickname, I think, and her actual name was Matilda, but they called her Queen Maude. There you go, that was the other one, the Empress Matilda. So there you go. Different name. Bess, Elizabeth. Maude, Matilda. I don't think they would have called these women that to their face, but they just talked about them using these names. Just because that's what people sometimes do. Whether it was from affection or whether it was derision, I'm not sure. And nicknames can be used in a lot of different ways of people when you're talking about them. Anyway, we'll carry on here. We are up to this bit. You name her lightly enough, young Burley. What might you know of her? Said she. Well, I've seen the little green shoes she left at Brickwall House. Down the road, you know. They're in a glass case. Awfully tiny things. Oh, Burley, Burley, she laughed. You are a courtier too soon. He's flattering this lady who was by commenting on how small her shoes were. Because in the old days, it was considered much more feminine for women to have small feet. Did you know that was partly why they used to bind the feet of girl babies in China? That was so they would keep small feet. And it meant that they couldn't actually walk very well, or lots of other things. But it was the higher up you were in society, the more it was considered important for women to have small feet. And so it wasn't a consideration of how healthy it would be, but it was we want them to have small feet, so we will make sure they have small feet. There you go. Anyway, so it was she considered this lady talking to us here considered it flattery when he commented on how small the shoes were. And we shall see how that goes. And I'm not quite sure why she's calling him Burley. Burley as in not muscular, but Burley, B-U-R-L-E-I-G-H, which probably has a meaning that maybe we should find out about. Anyway, I've written it down so I can. Oh, that was something I should have suggested to you. Find a piece of pen, a piece of paper, not a piece of pen, a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen. You can find a piece of pencil better than you can find a piece of pen to use properly. Anyway, there you go. Burley, Burley, she laughed. You are a courtier too soon. But they are, Dan insisted. As little as doll's shoes. Do you really know her well? Well, she was a woman. I've been at her court all my life. Yes, I remember when she danced after the banquet at Brickwall. They say she danced Philip of Spain out of a brand new kingdom that day. Worth the price of a pair of old shoes, hey? Now, Brickwall. It sounds like it's a real place. So, remember she was just saying to Una before that during dance is when a woman can strategize. And she has just said that the Queen Bess had danced the Philip of Spain, who was the king at the time of Spain and had broader territories than just Spain, out of a brand new kingdom, worth the price of a pair of old shoes, hey? She thrust out one foot and stooped forward to look at its broad flashing buckle. You've heard of Philip of Spain, long-suffering Philip, she said, her eyes still on the shining stones on the buckle of the shoe. Faith, what some men will endure at some women's hands passes belief. If I had been a man, and a woman had played me as Elizabeth played with Philip, I would have... She nipped off one of the Virginia stocks and held it up between finger and thumb. I would have... Snap. But for all that, she began to strip the leaves off one by one. They say, and I am persuaded, that Philip loved her. She tossed her head sideways. I don't quite understand, said Una. The high heavens forbid that you should, wench. She swept the flowers from her lap and stood up in the rush of shadows that the wind chased through the wood. I should like to know about the shoes, said Dan. So ye shall, Burley, so ye shall. If you watch me, 'twill be as good as a play. We've never been to a play, said Una. The lady looked at her and laughed. "I'll make one for you. Watch. You are to imagine that she, Gloriana, Belphoebe, Elizabeth, has gone on a progress to Rye to comfort her sad heart. Maids are often melancholic. And while she halts at Brickwall House, the village, what was its name?" She pushed Puck with her foot. Nudged him. "Norgem," he croaked, and squatted by the wigwam. Norgem. There you go. Norgem, he croaked, and squatted by the wigwam. Norgem village loyally entertains her with a masque or play. Masque was written with a Q in it. Or play, and a Latin oration spoken by the parson, for whose false quantities, if I'd made him in my girlhood, I should have been whipped. So the Latin oration was not really true to what it should have been, I think she's saying. "You whipped?" said Dan. "Soundly, sirrah, soundly. She stomachs the affront to her scholarship, makes her grateful gracious thanks from the teeth outwards, thus," the lady yawned. "Oh, a queen may love her subjects in her heart and yet be dog-wearied of 'em in body and mind, and so sits down, her skirts foamed about her as she sat, to a banquet beneath Brickwall Oak. Here for her sins she is waited upon by— what were the young cockerels' names that served Gloriana at table? Frewens, Courthopes, Fullers, Hussies, Puck began, listing off the people who had supplied the food. She held up her long jewelled hand. "Spare the rest, they were the best blood of Sussex, and by so much the more clumsy in handling the dishes and plates." Servants would have been better than people who were nobles of sort trying to serve her as servants, because you don't set commoners to work when you've got royalty visiting. "Wherefore," she looked funnily over her shoulder, "you are to think of Gloriana in a green and gold-laced habit, dreadfully expecting that the jostling youths behind her would, of pure jealousy or devotion, splatter it with sauces and wines. The gown was Philip's gift too, at this happy juncture. A queen's messenger, mounted and mired, spurs up the Rye road and delivers her a letter." She giggled. "A letter from a good, simple, frantic Spanish gentleman called Don Philip." "That wasn't Philip, King of Spain?" Dan asked. "Truly it was. Twixt you and me and the bedpost, young Burley, these kings and queens are very like men and women, and I've heard they write each other fond, foolish letters that none of their ministers should open." "Did her ministers ever open Queen Elizabeth's letters?" said Una. "Faith, yes, but she'd have done as much for theirs any day. You are to think of Gloriana, then, they say she had a pretty hand, excusing herself thus to the company, for the Queen's time is never her own, and while the music strikes up, reading Philip's letter, as I do." She drew a real letter from her pocket and held it out almost at arm's length, like the old postmistress in the village when she reads telegrams. "Philip writes as ever most lovingly. He says his Gloriana is cold, for which reason he burns for her through a fair written page." She turned it with a snap. "What's here? Philip complains that certain of her gentlemen have fought against his generals in the Low Countries. He prays her to hang him when they re-enter her realms. That's as may be. Here's a list of burnt shipping slipped between two vows of burning adoration. Oh, poor Philip. His admirals at sea, no less than 3 of them, have been boarded, sacked, and scuttled on their lawful voyages by certain English mariners, gentlemen he will not call them, who are now at large and working more piracies in his American Ocean, which the Pope gave him. He and the Pope should guard it then. Philip hears, but his devout ears will not credit it, that Gloriana in some fashion countenances these villains' misdeeds, shares in their booty, and, oh shame, has even lent them ships royal for their sinful thefts. Therefore he requires, which is a word Gloriana loves not, requires that she shall hang him when they return to England, and afterwards shall account to him for all the goods and gold they have plundered. A most loving request. If Gloriana will not be Philip's bride, she shall be his broker and his butcher. Should she still be stiff-necked, he writes, see where the pen digged the innocent paper, that he writes that he hath both the means and the intention to be revenged on her. Aha! Now we come to the Spaniard in his shirt. She waved the letter merrily. Listen here. Philip will prepare for Gloriana a destruction from the west, far exceeding that which Pedro de Avila wrought upon the Huguenots, and he rests and remains, kissing her feet and her hands, herself, her enemy, or her conqueror, as he shall find that she uses him. She thrust back the letter under her cloak and went on acting, but in a softer voice. All this while, hark on it, the wind blows through the brick-wall oak, the music plays, and with the company's eyes upon her, the Queen of England must think what this means. She cannot remember the name of Pedro de Villa, nor what he did to the Huguenots, nor when, nor where. She can only see darkly some motion moving in Philip's dark mind, for he hath never written before in this fashion. She must smile above the letter as though it were good news from her ministers, the smile that tires the mouth and the poor heart. What shall she do? Again her voice changed. You are to fancy that the music of a sudden wavers away. Chris Hatton, captain of her bodyguard, quits the table all red and ruffled, and Gloriana's virgin ear catches the clash of swords. At work, behind a wall, the mothers of Sussex look round to count their chicks, I mean those young gamecocks that waited on her. 2 dainty youths have stepped aside into Brickwall Garden with rapier and dagger. On a private point of honour, they are haled out through the gate, disarmed and glaring, the lively image of a brace of young cupids, transformed into pale, panting canes. Gloriana beckons awfully, thus. They come up for judgment. Their lives and estates lie at her mercy, whom they have doubly offended, both as queen and woman. But la, what will not young foolish men do for a beautiful maid? Why, what did she do? What had they done? Said Una. Shh! You mar the play. Gloriana had guessed the cause of the trouble. They were handsome lads. So she frowns a while and tells them not to be bigger fools than their mothers had made 'em, and warns 'em that if they do not kiss and be friends on the instant, she'll have Chris Hatton, Horse and Bircham, in the style of the new school at Harrow. Chris looked sour at that. Lastly, because she needed time to think on Philip's letter burning in her pocket, she signifies her pleasure to dance with him and teach him better manners, whereat the revived company call down heaven's blessing on her gracious head. Chris and the others prepare Brickwall House for a dance, and she walks in the clipped garden between those 2 lovely young sinners who are both ready to sink for shame. They confess their fault. It appears that midway in the banquet the elder, they were cousins, conceived that the Queen looked upon him with special favour. The younger, taking the look to himself after some words, gives the elder the lie, hence, as she guessed, the duel. And which had she really looked at? Dan asked. Neither, except to wish them farther off. She was afraid all the while they'd spilled dishes on her gown. She tells them this, poor chicks. And it completes their abasement. When they had grilled long enough, she says, and so you would have fleshed your maiden swords for me. Faith, they would have been at it again if she'd egged 'em on, but their swords, oh prettily they said it, had been drawn for her once or twice already. And where, says she, on your hobby horses, before you were breeched? On my own ship, says the elder. My cousin was vice-admiral of our venture in his pinnace. We would not have you think us as brawling children. No, no, says the younger, and flames like a very Tudor rose. He's blushed. At least the Spaniards know us better. Admiral Boy, Vice Admiral Babe, says Gloriana, I cry your pardon. Hang on, here we have a picture. She's walking in the garden. There she is. There's Gloriana, and then there's the two youths, young men. Admiral Boy, Vice Admiral Babe, says Gloriana, I cry your pardon. The heat of these present times ripens childhood to age more quickly than I can follow. But we are at peace with Spain. Where did you break your queen's peace? On the sea called the Spanish Main, though 'tis no more Spanish than my doublet, says the elder. Guess how that warmed Gloriana's already melting heart. Would she never suffer any sea to be called Spanish in her private? She would never suffer any sea to be called Spanish in her private hearing. And why was I not told? What booty got you, and where have you hid it? Disclose, says she. You stand in some danger of the gallows for pirates. The axe, most gracious lady, says the elder, for we are gentle born. Yes, in those days, for an execution, a gentle born, as in someone up in society, was beheaded, and the poor, or the ordinary people, were hung. He spoke truth, but no woman can brook contradiction. Hoity-toity, says she, but that she remembered that she was a queen, she'd have cuffed the pair of 'em. It shall be gallows, hurdle, and dung cart if I choose. Had our queen known of our going beforehand, Philip might have held her to blame for some small things we did on the seas. The younger lisps. Oh dear, that's what this letter's about from Philip. As these two fools have been off and done things in her name, basically, and Philip blames her for it, when in actual fact she had nothing to do with it. Oh dear, how's this going to work out? As for treasure, says the elder, we brought back but our bare lives. We were wrecked on the Gascons' graveyard, where our sole company for 3 months was the bleached bones of de Avila's men. Gloriana's mind jumped back to Philip's last letter. De Avila that destroyed the Huguenots. What do you know of him? She says. The music called from the house here, and they three turned back between the yews. Yews are a type of tree. Simply that de Avila broke in upon a plantation of Frenchmen on that coast, and very Spaniardly hung them all for heretics. 800 or so. The next year, Domingue de Gorres, a Gascon, broke in upon de Avila's men, and very justly hung them all for murderers. 500 or so. No Christians inhabit there now, said the elder lad, though 'tis a goodly land north of Florida. So this is on the American coast. How far is it from England? Asks prudent Gloriana. With a fair wind, 6 weeks, they say that Philip will plant it again soon. This was the younger, and he looked at her out of the corner of his innocent eye. Chris Hatton, fuming, meets and leads her into the brick wall house, where she dances thus. A woman can think while she dances. Can think. I'll show you. Watch. She took off her cloak slowly and stood forth in dove-coloured satin, worked over with pearls that trembled like running water in the running shadows of the trees, running shadows being probably because there's a breeze moving the leaves, and so it makes it look like ripples, dappled shade, running shadows. Still talking more to herself than to the children, she swam into a majestic dance of the stateliest balancings, the haughtiest wheelings and turnings aside, the most dignified sinkings, the gravest risings, all joined together by the elaboratest interlacing steps and circles. They leant forward breathlessly to watch the splendid acting. Would a Spaniard, she began, looking on the ground, speak of his revenge till his revenge were ripe? No, yet a man who loved a woman might threaten her in the hope that his threats would make her love him. Such things have been. She moved slowly across a bar of sunlight. A destruction from the west may signify that Philip means to descend on Ireland. But then my Irish spies would have had some warning. The Irish keep no secrets. No, it is not Ireland. Now, why? 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 The red shoes clicked and paused. Does Philip name Pedro Melendez de Avila a general in his Americas, unless, she turned more quickly, unless he intends to work his destruction from the Americas? Did he say de Avila only to put her off her guard, or for this once had his black pen betrayed his black heart? She raised herself to her full height, England must forestall Master Philip, but not openly. She sank again. We cannot fight Spain openly, not yet, not yet. She stepped 3 paces as though she were pegging down some snare with her twinkling shoe buckles. The Queen's mad gentlemen may fight Philip's poor admirals where they find him, but England, Gloriana, Harry's daughter, that's King Henry VIII, must keep the peace. Perhaps, after all, Philip loves her, as many men and boys do. That may help England. Oh, what shall help England? She raised her head, the masked head that seemed to have nothing to do with the busy feet, and stared straight at the children. I think this is rather creepy, said Anna, with a shiver. I wish she'd stop. The lady held out her jewelled hand as though she were taking someone else's hand in the grand chain, which is a movement in a dance, the grand chain. Can a ship go down into the Gascon's graveyard and wait there? She asked into the air and passed on rustling. She's pretending to ask one of the cousins, isn't she? Said Dan, and Puck nodded. Back she came in the silent, swaying, ghostly dance. They saw that she was smiling beneath the mask, and they could hear her breathing hard. I cannot lend you my ships for the venture. Philip would hear of it, she whispered over her shoulder, but as much guns and powder as you ask, if you do not ask too. Her voice shot up, and she stamped her foot thrice. Louder, louder, the music in the gallery. Oh, me, but I have burst out of my shoe. She gathered her skirts in each hand and began a curtsy. You will go at your own charges, she whispered straight before her. O enviable and adorable age of youth. Her eyes shone through the mask holes. But I warn you, you'll repent it. Put not your trust in princes or queens. Philip's ships will blow you out of water. You'll not be frightened? Well, we'll talk on it again when I return from Rye, dear lads. The wonderful curtsy ended. She stood up. Nothing stirred on her except the rush of the shadows. And so it was finished, she said to the children. Why do you not applaud? What was finished? Asked Una. Eh? What did you make of it, young Burley? I'm not quite sure, said Dan, beginning. But you never can be with a woman, But I thought Gloriana meant the cousins to go back to the Gascon's graveyard, wherever that was. 'Twas Virginia afterwards, her plantation of Virginia. Virginia afterwards, and stop Philip from taking it. Didn't she say she'd lend him guns? Right so, but not ships then. And I thought you meant they must have told her they'd do it off their own bat without getting her into a row with Philip. Was I right? Near enough for a minister of the Queen, but remember she gave the lads full time to change their minds. She was 3 long days at Rye Royal, knighting of fat mayors. So she's been creating mayors, like people who rule over the town. When she came back to Brickwall, they met her a mile down the road, and she could feel their eyes burn through her riding mask. Chris Hatton, poor fool, was vexed at it. You would not birch them when I gave you the chance, says she to Chris. Now you must get me half an hour's private speech with them at Brickwall Garden. Eve tempted Adam in a garden. Quick, man, or I may repent. She was a queen. Why did she not send for them herself? Said Una. The lady shook her head. That was never her way. I've seen her walk to her own mirror by ends, and the woman that cannot walk straight there is past praying for. Yet I would have you pray for her. What else in England's name could she have done? She lifted her hand to her throat for a moment. Faith, she cried, I'd forgotten the little green shoes. She left him at Brickwall, and so she did. And I remember she gave the Norgem parson, John Withers was he, a text for his sermon. Over Edom have I cast out my shoe. Neat, if he'd understood. I don't actually get what that reference is, by the way, sorry. Edom and casting out my shoe. I don't understand, said Una. What about the two cousins? You are as cruel as a woman, the lady answered. I was not to blame. I told you I gave 'em time to change their minds. She's just admitted that she is Queen Bess. Did you hear it? I gave 'em time to change their minds, on my honour. Ay de me. She asked no more of 'em at first than to wait a while off that coast, the Gascons' graveyard, to hover a little if their ships chance to pass that way. They had only one tall ship and a pinnace, which is a smaller sailing boat. Only to watch and bring me word of Philip's doings. One must watch Philip always. What a murrain right had he to make any plantation there, 100 leagues north of his Spanish main, and only 6 weeks from England? By my dread father's soul, I tell you he had none. She stamped her red foot again, and the two children shrunk back for a second. Nay, you must not turn from me too. She laid it all fairly before the lads in Brickwall Garden between the yews. I told him that if Philip sent a fleet, and to make a plantation he could not send less, their poor little cockboats could not sink it. They answered that with submission the fight would be their own concern. She showed him again that there could be only one end to it, quick death on the sea or slow death in Philip's prisons. They asked no more than to embrace death for my sake. Many men have prayed to me for life. I have refused them and slept none the worse after. But when my men, my tall, fantastical young men, beseech me on their knees for leave to die for me, it shakes me to the marrow of my old bones. Her chest sounded like a board as she hit it. So she thumped herself in the chest when she said, it shakes me to the marrow of my old bones. She showed 'em all. I told 'em that this was no time for open war with Spain. If by miracle inconceivable they prevailed against Philip's fleet, Philip would hold me accountable. For England's sake, to save war, I should e'en be forced, I told 'em so, to give him up their young lives. If they failed and again by some miracle escaped Philip's hand and crept back to England with their bare lives, they must lie, I told them all, under my sovereign displeasure. She could not know them, see them, nor hear their names, nor stretch out a finger to save them from the gallows if Philip chose to ask it. So, yes, she's royal, and apparently she speaks of herself in the third person. Be it the gallows, then, said the elder. I could have wept, but that my face was made for the day. As in, she was wearing makeup, so she didn't weep because it would have ruined her makeup. Either way, anyway, this venture is death, which I know you fear not. But it is death with assured dishonour, I cried. Yet our queen will know in her heart that we have done it, said the younger. Sweetheart, said I, a queen has no heart. But she is a woman, and a woman would not forget, said the elder. We will go, they knelt at my feet. Nay, dear lads, but here, I said, and I opened my arms to them and I kissed them. Be ruled by me, I said. We'll hire some ill-featured old tarry breeks of an admiral to watch the graveyard, and you shall come to court. Hire whom you please, says the elder. We are ruled by you, body and soul. And the younger, who shook most when I kissed him, says between his white lips, I think you have power to make a god of a man. Come to court and be sure of it, I says. They shook their heads, and I knew that go they would. If I had not kissed them, perhaps I might have prevailed. Then why did you do it? Said Una. I don't think you knew really what you wanted done. May it please your majesty, the lady bowed her head low, this Gloriana whom I have represented for your pleasure was a woman and a queen. Remember her when you come to your kingdom. But did the cousins go to the Gascon's graveyard? Said Dan as Una frowned. They went, said the lady. Did they ever come back? Una began, but... Did they stop King Philip's fleet? Dan interrupted. The lady turned to him eagerly. Do you think they did right to go? She asked. I don't see what else they could have done, said Dan. After thinking it over, do you think she did right to send him? The lady's voice rose a little. Well, said Dan, I don't see what else she could have done either. Do you? How did they stop King Philip from getting Virginia? There's the sad part of it. They sailed out that autumn from Rye Royal, obviously that's the name at the time of the port, and there never came back so much as a single rope yarn to show what had befallen them. The winds blew and they were not. Does that make you alter your mind, young Burley? I expect they were drowned then. Anyhow, Philip didn't score, did he? Gloriana wiped out her score with Philip later. But if Philip had won, would you have blamed Gloriana for wasting those lads' lives? Of course not. She was bound to try to stop him, said Dan. The Queen coughed. You have the root of the matter in you. Were I Queen, I'd make you minister. We don't play that game, said Una, who felt that she disliked the lady as much as she disliked the noise the high wind made, tearing through Willow Shore. Play, said the lady with a laugh, and threw up her hands affectedly. The sunshine caught the jewels of her many rings and made them flash, till Una's eyes dazzled. And she had to rub them, and then she saw Dan on his knees picking up the potatoes they had spilled at the gate. There wasn't anybody in the shore after all, he said. Didn't you think you saw someone? I'm most awfully glad there isn't, said Una. Then they went on with the potato roast. So there you go. That's the end of that section of the story. I'm looking to see what's next. Yes, there is a poem for the end of the story, and I shall read it to you. The Looking Glass. Queen Bess was Harry's daughter. The Queen was in her chamber, and she was middling old. Her petticoat was satin, and her stomacher was gold. A stomacher is the piece of the garment that comes down from up here, down and across the stomach. It was actually a separate piece of clothing, and it was named as such. So there you go. That's just a weird word that I'm explaining for you. Her petticoat was satin and her stomacher was gold. Backwards and forwards and sideways did she pass, making up her mind to face the cruel looking glass. The cruel looking glass that will never show a lass as comely or as kindly or as young as once she was. The Queen was in her chamber, a combing of her hair. There came Queen Mary's spirit, and it stood behind her chair, singing backwards and forwards and sideways may you pass, but I will stand behind you till you face the looking glass. The cruel looking glass that will never show a lass as lovely or unlucky or as lonely as I was. I haven't finished, I just need Queen Mary was Mary Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had beheaded. Because she was her rival, she would have taken the crown. She would have taken the role of being the queen. And she put it off as long as she possibly could. But everybody said somebody will use her against you. So in the end, she had her put to death. Carrying on with the poem, the Queen was in her chamber, a weeping very sore. There came Lord Leicester's spirit, and it scratched upon the door. I'm guessing Lord Leicester is another one she had killed. singing backwards and forwards and sideways may you pass, but I will walk beside you till you face the looking glass, the cruel looking glass that will never show a lass as hard and unforgiving or as wicked as you was. The queen was in her chamber, her sins were on her head. She looked the spirits up and down, and stately she said, backwards and forwards and sideways have I been, yet I am Harry's daughter, and I am England's queen. And she faced the looking glass and whatever else there was, and she saw her day was over, and she saw her beauty pass. In the cruel looking glass that can always hurt a lass, more hard than any ghost, there is or any man there was. More hard than any ghost there is or any man there was. So seeing yourself in the looking glass when you have grown old and you have all this on your conscience is more harsh than all those ghosts and memories against you. I think is what that's about. Anyway, so we'll have a wee break. I'll have another drink of water. I'm hoping the next one's not quite as weird wordy. Yeah, anyway. Usually there's a little bit more action in a story, a little bit more the children finding out about places, not just straight out recitations of history from the point of view of Queen Bess, who was pretending that she was someone else pretending to be Queen Bess. Strangely. Yeah, anyway, whatever. We'll get there. Just slightly odd. But then some of these older ones are. And that's just the way it goes. So I've got my snacks. Have you got yours? I've got some honey roast peanuts. Yummy. And if you haven't, you've got a minute or two to rush off and get some. And then come back. I won't promise to wait till you're back, so you better be quick. Anyway. Now this is because we're between chapters, or sections, because this is a weird book in terms of not having chapters. I can chat with you without actually having to follow the words on the page. One of the things I was going to say is that Twitch has now got a new system in place where if you create them or have them created for you, you can actually upload emotes so that anyone can use them in your chat. And if it's someone, and they've made them available for followers, which means that you don't have to have paid to still get custom emotes available. I haven't made mine yet. So if you're following me and you're waiting for them, I'm sorry, I will get around to it. I'm still learning how to use that the drawing function of my graphics program. I can do photos, I can do edits on things like that, but I haven't yet figured out how to trace a photograph and make it look sort of like more like an emote with a little bit more of a cartoony look. And I'm not going to be putting money into this at this stage. I think it would be a cool thing to be able to do some myself. I have one already, but that's a sub emote and it's not as good as I want. It was created through an app and I want to sharpen it up so that it works well at that really, really small scale. And that was another thing that they increased, was that instead of just having one sub emote, you can actually have 5 sub emotes, as well as being able to have 5 follower emotes, even if you haven't got a large list of financial followers. So that's really cool. And that's something I'm looking at doing. And I'm thinking basically just my version of some commonly used internet style acronyms like LOL. So therefore it'll be a cartoon picture of me laughing ridiculously sort of thing. And that can be used instead. And like you have the normal smiley emotes on your text and things like that, but customized ones. Anyway, strange, but yeah, we'll get there. Yeah, I've just got to learn some skills on that. I haven't yet, because I've got a graphics tablet, a really basic one, and I need to learn how to use it. It's easier to do with a felt tip pen and some tracing paper than it actually is with a graphics tablet because I'm having to use my hand and the pen differently to what I would with a felt tip pen, or my brain is saying I have to do it differently. So we'll get there, won't we, eventually? Are you ready for some more story? We'll carry on, shall we? This section is called The Wrong Thing, A Truthful Song, Part 1. The Bricklayer. I tell this tale which is strictly true, just by way of convincing you how very little since things were made, things have yes, that's correct, things have altered in the building trade. And we shall carry on from there. I'm just thinking about what they said. This is based in England, where they build with bricks a lot more than what we do in New Zealand. They build structurally with bricks. We don't. We don't rely on gravity to hold a building together in New Zealand because we have earthquakes. Anyway, a year ago, come the middle of March, we was building flats near the Marble Arch when a thin young man with coal-black hair came up to watch us working there. So this is in London, because Marble Arch is in London. Now there wasn't a trick in brick or stone that this young man hadn't seen or known, nor there wasn't a tool from trowel to maul, but this young man could use 'em all. Then up and spoke the plumber's bold, which was laying the pipes for the hot and cold. Since you with us have made so free, will you kindly say what your name might be? The young man kindly answered them, it might be Lot or Methusalem, or it might be Moses, a man I hate, whereas it is Pharaoh surnamed Great. Your glazing is new and your plumbing's strange, but otherwise I perceive no change, and in less than a month, if you do as I bid, I'll learn you to build me a pyramid. That's a bit different. Part 2 of this one called A Truthful Song. I'm guessing we're going to get a different trade or work type. Part 2. The Sailor. Tell this tale which is strict or true, just by way of convincing you how very little since things was made, things have altered in the shipwrights trade. In Blackwall Basin yesterday a china bark refitting lay, when a fat old man with snow white hair came up to watch us working there. Now there wasn't a knot which the riggers knew, but the old man made it, and better too. Nor there wasn't a sheet or a lift or a brace, but the old man knew its lead and place. Then up and spake the caulkyers bold, which was packing the pump in the afterhold. Since you with us have made so free, will you kindly tell what your name might be? The old man kindly answered them, it might be Japheth, it might be Shem, or it might be Ham, though his skin was dark, whereas it's Noah, commanding the ark. Your wheel is new, and your pumps are strange, but otherwise I perceive no change, and in less than a week, if she did not ground, I'd sail the sook of the whole wide world round. Both. We tell these tales which are the strictest true, etc., etc. And that's the end of that. So, 2 poems about how, for a very long time, the ways of building things have not changed. In the last 100 years they have, and they have changed a lot. But back in the time when Rudyard Kipling was writing, they were building houses and boats the same way they had been building them for hundreds and even thousands of years. And that's what those poems were about, that the poem was about. The Wrong Thing. Dan had gone in for building model boats, but after he had filled the schoolroom with chips, that's wood shavings, which he expected Una to clear away, they turned him out of doors and he took all his tools up the hill to Mr. Springett's yard, where he knew he could make as much mess as he chose. Old Mr. Springett was a builder, contractor and sanitary engineer, and his yard, which opened off the village street, was always full of interesting things. At one end of it was a long loft, reached by a ladder, where he kept his iron-bound scaffold planks. Iron-bound. To stop them, a scaffold plank is a big, long piece of timber that is a reasonable thickness, but it's strong enough to be supported at each end, and you can walk on it, you can stand on it, so that you are up above ground level to work on the side of something like a building. Okay, and to stop the wood from splitting, because it's quite common for wood to split, it's iron bound. That means it has a strap of metal round the ends of it so that the wood won't split. Sometimes it would have pieces across it at other places too, not just at the ends. But even these days, scaffold planks made out of wood, timber, will often have a strip of metal across the ends of them to stop them splitting. And also, if they get dropped, they're less likely to be made to split by hitting the ground. So that's what that reference was, sorry. Finding it again, where he kept his iron-bound scaffold planks, tins of paints, pulleys, and odds and ends he had found in old houses. He would sit here by the hour, watching his carts as they loaded or unloaded in the yard below, while Dan gouged and grunted at the carpenter's bench near the loft window. Mr. Springett and Dan had always been particular friends, for Mr. Springett was so old he could remember when railways were being made in the southern counties of England, and people were allowed to drive dogs in carts. Yes, a dog cart was a cart that was pulled by a dog. So if you weren't rich enough to have a horse or a pony or a mule or a donkey, you could have a dog pull your cart. Not very much, not a lot of weight, but you could use it for carrying things instead of you carrying things. One hot, still afternoon, the tar paper on the roof smelt like ships. And I am going to interrupt again. Tar was used for caulking on ships, waterproofing the caulking on ships. So you poke fibre, oakum fibre, into the grooves between planks. The planks were fastened close together, but as the wood swells with water and then shrinks with the heat and things like that, it moves a little bit and you get openings and water starts leaking into the boat. And you don't want water leaking into the boat because the boat might sink. And also the extra water, if it gets too much in it, will damage whatever it is that you're using as your cargo. And so you pack this fibre. It's a little bit like if you frayed a piece of old rope or string, that sort of soft stuff, and it was poked in tightly and hammered in with a maul into the groove there, and then often you would have pitch or tar over the outside. It would waterproof it. The fibre was good because it would actually swell up with water and stop water coming through. It would start to get water into it, and then that would swell and stop it from getting through. But to add an extra layer of protection, you also put tar on it. That's why sailors used to be called old tars or Jolly Jack Tar. Anyway, so that's the reference to it smelling like ships. One hot, still afternoon, the tar paper on the roof smelt like ships. Dan in his shirt sleeves was smoothing down a new schooner's bow, and Mr. Springett was talking of barns and houses he had built. He said he never forgot any stick or stone he had ever handled, or any man, woman, or child he had ever met. Just then he was very proud of the village hall at the entrance to the village, which he had finished a few weeks before. "And I don't mind telling you, Master Dan," he said, "that the hall will be my last job top of this mortal earth. I didn't make £10 nor yet 5 out of the whole contract, but my name's lettered on the foundation stone, Ralph Springett, builder, and the stone she's bedded on 4 foot good concrete. If she shifts any time these 500 years, I'll surely turn in my grave. I told the London architect so when he came down to oversee my work." "What did he say?" Dan was sandpapering the schooner's port bow. "Nothing. The hall ain't more than one of his small jobs for him. But 'tain't small to me, and my name is cut and lettered, frontin' the village street. I do hope and pray for some time everlasting. You'll want the little round file for that horror in the bow." "Who's there?" Mr. Springett turned stiffly in his chair. A long pile of scaffold planks ran down the centre of the loft. Dan looked and saw Hal of the Draft's tousled head beyond them. Now, in case you're wondering, Hal of the Draft is Hal, who was a draftsman or architect from one of our previous stories in Puck of Pook's Hill. So he's another historic character, well, within the context of the books. And here we are, we've got Hal of the Draft has turned up in the loft. Sorry, I've just got peanuts tickling the side of my mouth. "Be you the builder of the village hall?" he asked of Mr. Springett. "I be," was the answer. "But if you want a job," Hal laughed. "No, faith," he said. "Only the hall is as good and honest a piece of work as I've ever run a rule over. So, being born hereabouts and being reckoned a master among masons and accepted as a master mason, I made bold to pay my brotherly respects to the builder." There you go. Mr. Springett looked important. "I be a bit rusty, but I'll try ye." He asked Hal several curious questions, and the answers must have pleased him, for he invited Hal to sit down. Hal moved up, always keeping behind the pile of planks so that only his head showed, and sat on a trestle in the dark corner at the back of Mr. Springett's desk. He took no notice of Dan, but talked at once to Mr. Springett about bricks and cement and lead and glass, and after a while Dan went on with his work. He knew Mr. Springett was pleased because he tugged his white sandy beard and smoked his pipe in short puffs. The two men seemed to agree about everything, but when grown-ups agree, they interrupt each other almost as much as if they were quarrelling. Hal said something about workmen. "Why, that's what I always say," Mr. Springett cried. "A man who can only do one thing, he's but next above fool to the man that can't do nothing. That's where the unions make their mistake." "My thought to the very dot," Dan heard Hal slap his tight-hosed leg. "I've suffered in my time from these same guilds. Unions, d'ye call 'em? All their precious talk of the mysteries of their trades. Why, what does it come to?" I'm thinking that Hal's staying physically mainly out of sight because he's dressed from his era, and Mr. Springett might think that's a bit weird. "Nothing. You've just about hit it," said Mr. Springett, and rammed his hot tobacco with his thumb. "Take the art of wood carving," Hal went on. He reached across the planks, grabbed a wooden mallet, and moved his other hand as though he wanted something. Mr. Springett, without a word, passed him one of Dan's broad chisels. Wood carving, for example. If you can cut wood and have a fair draught of what ye mean to do, a heaven's name, take chisel and maul, and let drive at it, say I. You'll soon find all the mystery, forsooth, of wood carving under your proper hand. In other words, getting to it and trying, you'll learn a lot. Whack came the mallet on the chisel, and a sliver of wood curled up in front of it. Mr. Springett watched like an old raven. There's quite an art to using a chisel and mallet. I've seen people go at it and not to make a good job of it, and people who have many years' experience as builders with hand tools make a good job of it. Trust me, it takes skill. "All art is one, man, one," said Hal between whacks, "and to wait on another man to finish out." "To finish out your work ain't no sense," Mr. Springett cut in. "That's what I'm always saying to the boy here." He nodded towards Dan. "That's what I said when I put that new wheel into Brewster's mill in 1872. I reckoned I was millwright enough for the job without bringing a man from Lunnon, and besides, dividing up work eats up profits. No bounds." Hal laughed his beautiful deep laugh, and Mr. Springett joined in, till Dan laughed too. "You handle your tools, I can see," said Mr. Springett. "I reckon if you're any way like me, you've found yourself hindered by these guilds, did you call 'em? Unions, we say." "You may say so." Hal pointed to a white scar on his cheekbone. "This is a remembrance from the master watching foreman of masons on Magdalen Tower, because, please you, I dared to carve stone without their leave. They said a stone had slipped from the cornice by accident." "I know them accidents. There's no way to disprove 'em, and stones ain't the only things to slip." Mr. Springett grunted. Hal went on. "I've seen a scaffold plank kickle and shoot two clever workmen 30 foot onto the cold chancel floor below." He would have been dead. "And a rope can break." Yes, natural is nature, and lime will fly up in a man's eyes without any breath of wind sometimes, said Mr. Springett. But who's to show 'twasn't an accident? Lime will actually blind them because it is alkali, I think. I don't think it's acidic. Who do these things? Dan asked, and straightened his back at the bench as he turned the schooner end for end in the vice to get at her counter. That's her stern. Them which don't wish other men to work no better nor quicker than they do, growled Mr. Springett. Don't pinch her so hard in the vice, Master Dan. Put a piece of rag in the jaws or you'll bruise her. More than that, he turned towards Hal, if a man has his private spite laid up against you, the unions give him his excuse for working it off. Well, I know it, said Hal. They never let you go, them spiteful ones. I knowed a plasterer in 1861 down to the wells. He was a Frenchie, a bad enemy he was. I had mine too. He was an Italian called Benedetto. I met him first at Oxford on Magdalen Tower, which I think they now call Magdalen. When I was learning my trade, said Hal, or trades, I should say. A bad enemy he was, as you say, but he came to be my singular good friend, said Hal, as he put down the mallet and settled himself comfortably. What might his trade have been? Plastering? Mr. Springett asked. Plastering of a sort. He worked in stucco, fresco we call it. Made pictures on plaster. Not but what he had a fine sweep of the hand in drawing. He'd take the long sides of a cloister, trowel on his stuff and roll out his great all-abroad pictures of saints and croppy-topped trees, quick as a Webster unrolling cloth almost. Old Benedetto could draw, but was a little-minded man, professing to be full of secrets of colour or plaster, common tricks, all of him, and his one single talk was how Tom, Dick or Harry had stole this or that or t'other secret art from him. Just in case you're wondering, I'm going to interrupt here. Fresco, stucco. You put the plaster on, and while it's damp, you apply the colour of the artwork that you are creating. You paint directly onto damp plaster, and it sucks the colour in, and it makes it more intense. I'm not sure, but it's a particular technique. I know that sort, said Mr. Springett. There's no keeping peace or making peace with such, and they're mostly born and bone idle. True, even his fellow countrymen laughed at his jealousy. We too came to loggerheads early on Magdalen Tower. I was a youngster then, said Hal. Maybe I spoke my mind about his work. You shouldn't never do that, Mr. Springett shook his head. That sort lay it up against you. True enough. This Benedetto did most specially. Body o' me, the man lived to hate me. Just writing his name down, Benedetto. Magdalen Tower. This man lived to hate me, but I always kept my eyes open on a plank or a scaffold. I was mighty glad to be shut of him when he quarrelled with his guild foreman and went off nose in air and paints under his arm. But, Hal leaned forward, if you hate a man or a man hates you, I know, you're everlasting running across him. Mr. Springett interrupted. Excuse me, sir. He leaned out the window and shouted to a carter who was loading a cart with bricks. Ain't you got no more sense than to heap 'em up that way, he said. Take and throw 100 of him off. It's more than the team can compass. Throw him off, I tell you, and make another trip for what's left over. Excuse me, sir. You were saying? I was saying that before the end of the year I went to Bury to strengthen the lead work in the great Abbey east window there. Now that's just one of the things I've never done, but I mind there was a cheap excursion to Chichester in 1879 and I went and watched him leading a wonderful fine window in Chichester Cathedral. I stayed watching till 'twas time for us to go back. Dunno as I had 2 drinks perhaps all that day. Which is quite funny, because most of the others, if they're on an excursion, they'll be going and getting drinks. And obviously he didn't. He was intrigued. I'm just writing down other things to look up. A cathedral at Bury and Chichester. There we go. Maybe we'll find out something about them. Because Rudyard Kipling would often reference real places, real things in his stories. Anyway, carrying on. I had perhaps 2 drinks all that day, Hal smiled. At Bury then, sure enough, I met my enemy Benedetto. He had painted a picture in plaster on the south wall of the refectory, a noble place for a noble thing, a picture of Jonah. Ah, Jonah and his whale. I've never been as far as Bury. You've worked about a lot, said Mr. Springett with his eyes on the carter below. That's the chap loading bricks onto his cart down in the yard. No, not the whale. This was a picture of Jonah and the Pompion that withered. Remember at the end of the story of Jonah and the whale, Jonah is sitting in the desert, sitting somewhere, sulking because the city he was sent to tell to repent turned from their bad ways, and his nose was out of joint because he wanted them to be punished. He had been sent to tell them that they would be punished if they didn't change. And so he's sitting off having a bit of a moan to himself about the fact that God didn't punish them, even though they'd changed their mind, and that was what it was meant to be all about. And a plant had grown up to give him shade in this intense heat. And in the end, the plant had died in the heat. And so God speaks to Jonah and says to him, you've got mercy on that plant there, and yet you expect me to not show mercy on these people. Check your heart, mate. That's basically what that one's about. So Hal, for some reason, calls it a Pompion. This is a picture of Jonah and the Pompion that withered, but all that Benedetto had shown was a peevish grey beard huddled up in an angle-edged drapery beneath a pompion on a wooden trellis. This last, being a dead thing, he'd drawn it as 'twere to the life, but fierce old Jonah, bared in the sun, angry even to death that his cold prophecy was disproven, Jonah, ashamed and already hearing the children of Nineveh running to mock him, that was what Benedetto had not drawn. He had better stuck to his whale then, said Mr. Springett. He'd have done no better with that. He draws the damp cloth off the picture and shows it to me. I was a craftsman too, d'ye see. 'Tis good, said I said, but it goes no deeper than the plaster. What? He said in a whisper. Be thy own judge, Benedetto, I answered. Does it go deeper than the plaster? Remember what I told you about how these pictures are made on the surface of the plaster? I think the point here is about what the story is telling, going deeper inside someone that changes them rather than just a picture. He reeled against a piece of dry wall. No, he says, and I know it. I could not hate thee more than I have done these 5 years, but if I live I will try, Hal, I will try to hate him more. Then he goes away. I pitied him, but I had spoken truth. His picture went no deeper than the plaster. Ah, said Mr. Springett, who had turned quite red. You was talking so fast I didn't understand what you was driving at, and I've seen men, good workmen they was, try to do more than they could do, and they couldn't compass it. They knowed it, and it nigh broke their hearts like. You was in your right, of course, sir, to say what you thought his work, but if you'll excuse me, was you in your duty? I was wrong to say it, Hal replied. God forgive me, I was young. He was workman enough himself to know where he'd failed, but it all came evens in the long run. By the same token, did you ever hear of one Torrigiano? Torrisani, we called him. I can't say I ever did. Was he a Frenchy like? No, a hectoring, hard-mouthed, long-sworded Italian builder, as vain as a peacock and as strong as a bull, but mark you, a master workman. More than that, he could get his best work out of the worst men. Which it's a gift. I had a foreman bricklayer like him once, said Mr. Springer. He used to prod him in the back with a pointing trowel, and they did wonders. A pointing trowel is the ones that you see pictures of, where they're laying bricks and they have this diamond shape. It's a long diamond shape like this with a handle on it, and it's quite narrow and pointy at the top. So, yeah, that would have been uncomfortable to be poked with. I've seen it. Hang on, I'm just checking who's talking now. I've seen our Torrisani lay apprentice down with one buffet and raise him with another, to make a mason of him. I worked under him at building a chapel in London, a chapel and a tomb for the king. I never knew kings went to chapel much, said Mr. Springett, but I always hold with a man, don't care who he be, seeing about his own grave before he dies. Tidn't the sort of thing to leave to your family after the will's read. I reckon 'twas a fine vault. None finer in England. This Torrigiano had the contract for it, as you'd say. He'd picked master craftsmen from all parts. England, France, Italy, the Low Countries. No odds to him as long as they knew their work, and he drove him like pigs at Brightling Fair. He called us English all pigs. We suffered it because he was a master in his craft. If he misliked any work that a man had done, with his own great hands he'd rive it out and tear it down before us all. Ah, you pig, you English pig, he'd scream in the dumb wretch's face. You answer me, you look at me, you think at me. Come out with me into the cloisters, I'll teach you carving myself. I will gild you all over. But when his passion had blown out, he'd slip his arm out round the man's neck and impart knowledge worth gold. 'Twould have done your art good, Master Springett, to see the 200 of us, masons, jewellers, carvers, gilders, ironworkers, and the rest, all toiling like cock angels in this mad Italian ornate, fleeing from one to next, up and down the chapel. Done your art good, it would. I believe you, said Mr. Springett. In 1854, I mind, the rail was being made into Hastings. It was 2,000 navvies on it, all young, all strong, and I was one of 'em. Oh, dearie me, excuse me, sir, but was your enemy working with you? Benedetto? Be sure he was. He followed me like a lover. He painted pictures on the chapel ceiling, slung from a chair. Torrigiano made us promise not to fight till the work should be finished. We was both master craftsmen, d'ye see, and he needed us. None the less, I never went aloft to carve without testing all my ropes and knots each morning. We were never far from each other. Benedetto had sharpened his knife on his sole while he waited for his plaster to dry. That's probably the sole of his boot. Wheat, 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 I'd hear it where I hung chipping round a pillar head, and we'd nod to each other friendly like. Oh, he was a craftsman, was Benedetto, but his hate spoiled his eye and his hand. I mind the night I had finished the models for the bronze saints round the tomb. Torrigiano embraced me before all the chapel and bade me to supper. I met Benedetto when I came out. He was slavering in the porch like a mad dog. Working himself up to it, said Mr. Springett. Did he have it in that night? No. That time he kept his oath to Torrigiano, but I pitied him. Well, now I come to my own follies. I had never thought too little of myself, but after Torrisani had put his arm round my neck, Hal broke into a laugh. I lay there was not much odds twixt me and a cock sparrow in his pride. I was pretty middlin' young once upon a time, said Mr. Springett. Then ye know that a man can't drink and dice and dress fine and keep company above his station, but his work suffers for it, Mr. Springett. I never held much with dressing up, but you're right. The worst mistakes I ever made, they was made on a Monday morning, Mr. Springett answered. We've all been one sort of a fool or t'other. Master Dan, take the smallest gouge or you'll be splutting her stern works clean out. Can't you see the grain of the wood don't favour a chisel? I'll spare you, so he was just talking to Dan about the work he's doing on the boat. I'll spare you some of my follies, but there was a man called Bob Brigandine, clerk of the king's ships, a little smooth, bustling atomy, A-T-O-M-Y, hang on, it's split across two lines. I don't know, atomy. As clever as a woman to get work done for nothing. A wonderful smooth-tongued pleader. He made much of me and asked me to draft him out a drawing, a piece of carved and gilded scroll work for the bows of one of the king's ships. The Sovereign was her name. Was she a man of war? Asked Dan. She was a warship, and a woman called Catherine of Castile desired the king to give her the ship for a pleasure ship of her own. That's Catherine of Castile. I'm not sure if that's the same as Catherine of Aragon, but a real queen. Sorry, I'm just trying to find where I got up to. I did not know at the time, but she'd been at Bob to get this scroll work done and fitted that the king might see it. I made him the picture in an hour, all of a heat after supper, one great heaving play of dolphins and a Neptune or so raining in web-by-footed seahorses, and Arion with his harp high atop of them. So Arion, I think, was a particular mythical harp player. A-R-I-O-N, harp. Another one to look up. Yes, Kipling expects us to know these references he makes. And he probably thinks that we have all learned Latin at school as well. It may be Greek mythology he might be thinking of. Arion with his harp high atop of them. It was 23 foot long and maybe 9 foot deep, painted and gilded. So that's a jolly big bit of woodwork for decorative stuff. It must just about look fine, said Mr. Springett. That's the curiosity of it. 'Twas bad, rank bad. In my conceit, I must needs show it to Torrigiano in the chapel. He straddles his legs, that means he stood with his legs wide apart, hunches his knife behind him and whistles like a stormcock through a sleet shower. Benedetto was behind him. He was never far apart, I've told you. That is pig's work, says our master, swine's work. You make any more such things, even after your fine court suppers, and you shall be sent away. Benedetto licks his lips like a cat. Is it so bad then, master? He says. What a pity. Yes, says Torrigiano. Scarcely you could do things so bad, I will condescend to show. He talks to me then and there, no shouting, no swearing. It was too bad for that. But good, memorable counsel, bitten in slowly. Then he sets me to draft out a pair of iron gates, to take, as he said, the taste of my naughty dolphins out of my mouth. Iron sweet stuff if you don't torture her, and hammered work is all pure, truthful line, with a reason and a support for every curve and bar of it. A week at that settled my stomach handsomely, and the master let me put the work through the smithy, where I sweated out more of my foolish pride. Good stuff is good iron, said Mr. Springett. I done a pair of lodge gates once in 1863. Oh, I forgot to say that Bob brigandine whipped away my draft of the ship's scroll work and would not give it back to me to redraw. He said 'twould do well enough. Howsoever, my lawful work kept me too busy to remember him. Body o' me, but I worked that winter upon the gates and the bronzes for the tomb as I'd never worked before. I was leaner than a lath, but I lived then. Hal looked at Mr. Springett with his wise, crinkled-up eyes, and the old man smiled back. "Ouch!" Dan cried. He'd been hollowing out the schooner's aft deck. The little gouge had slipped and gashed the ball of his left thumb. An ugly, triangular tear. "That came of not steadying your wrist," said Hal calmly. "Don't bleed over the wood. Do your work with your heart's blood, but no need to let it show." He rose and peered into a corner of the loft. Mr. Springett had risen too and swept down a ball of cobwebs from a rafter. "Clap that on," was all he said, "and put your handkerchief atop. 'Twill cake over in a minute. It won't hurt now. Do it." "It don't hurt now, do it?" "No," said Dan indignantly. "You know it has happened lots of times. I'll tie it up myself. Go on, sir." So what Mr. Springett just did was he gave him some cobweb to put over the gash before he tied his handkerchief round it. Did you know that cobwebs are very good for causing the blood to clot so it stops bleeding when you cut yourself? There you go. It was a very commonly used thing, and it's true. It does actually work. I'm not sure how, but it does. Maybe it's just because it's all this mesh of little threads and stuff that the blood can actually hold on to and clot together. "And it'll happen hundreds of times more," said Hal with a friendly nod as he sat down again. But he did not go on till Dan's hand was tied up properly. Then he said, "One dark December day, too dark to judge colour, we was all sitting and talking round the fires in the chapel. You heard good talk there when Bob Brigandine bustles in and says, 'How, you're sent for,' he squeals. 'I was at Torrigiano's feet on a pile of putlocks, as I might be here toasting a herring on my knife's point. 'Twas the one English thing our master liked, salt herring. I'm busy about my art, I calls. 'Art,' says Bob. 'What's art compared to your scroll work for the sovereign? Come.' 'Be sure your sins will find you out,' says Torrigiano. 'Go with him and see.' As I followed Bob out, I was aware of Benedetto like a black spot where their eyes are tired, slithering up behind me. Bob hurries through the streets in the raw fog, slips into a doorway, upstairs, along passages, and at last thrusts me into a little cold room, vilely hung with Flemish tapestries and no furnishings except a table and my draft of the sovereign's scroll work. Here he leaves me. Presently comes in a dark, long-nosed man in a fur cap. 'Master Harry Daw,' says he. 'The same,' I says. Where a plague has Bob Brigandine gone?' His thin eyebrows surged up a piece and come down again in a stiff bar. 'He went to the king,' he says. 'All one, what's your pleasure with me?' I says, shivering, for it was mortal cold. He lays his hand flat on my draft. 'Master Daw,' he says, 'do you know the present price of gold leaf for all this wicked gilding of yours?' By that I guessed he was some cheese-paring clerk or other of the king's ships. Cheese-paring, cutting little bits off the edge to save money. Sorry, just trying to get my chair to be in the right place for you. No, that's not working. Try again. Hang on. I'm not sure. We'll see if that works. But I guessed he was some cheese-paring clerk or other of the king's ships, so I give him the price. I forget it now, but it worked out to £30, carved, gilt, and fitted in place. £30, he says, as though I'd pulled a tooth of him. You talk as though £30 was to be had for the asking. None the less, he says, your draft's a fine piece of work. I'd been looking at it ever since I came in, and 'twas viler ever than I'd judged it At first, my iron hand had been purified the past months, d'ye see, by my ironwork. I could do it better now, I said. The more I studied my squabby Neptunes, and the less I liked 'em, and Arion was a pure flamin' shame atop the unbalanced dolphins. I doubt it will be fresh expense to draft it again, he says. Bob never paid me for the first draft. I lay he'll never pay me for the second. 'Twill cost the king nothing if I'd redraw it, I says. There's a woman wishes it to be done quickly, he says. We'll stick to your first drawing, Master Daw, but £30 is £30. You must make it less. This is for the cost of actually doing the work, building it, and doing the finishing work on it, the gold leaf. And all the while the faults in my draft fair leapt out at me and hit me between the eyes. At any cost, I thinks to myself, I must get it back and redraft it. He grunts at me impatiently, and a splendid thought comes to me which shall save me. By the same token, 'twas quite honest. They ain't always, said Mr. Springett. How did you get out of it? By the truth, I says to Master Furcap, as I might to you here, I says, I'll tell you something, since you seem a knowledgeable man. Is the sovereign to lie in Thames River all her days, or will she take the high seas? Oh, he says quickly, the king keeps no cats that don't catch mice. She must sail the seas, Master Daw. She'll be hired to merchants for the trade. She'll be out in all shapes of weathers. Does that make any odds? Why then, says I, the first heavy sea she sticks her nose into will claw off half that scroll work, and the next will finish it. If she's meant for a pleasure ship, give me my draft again, and I'll portray you a pretty light piece of scroll work, good cheap. If she's meant for the open sea, pitch the draft into the fire. She can never carry that weight on her bows. He looks at me, squintlings, and plucks his under lip. Is that your honest, unswayed opinion? He says. Body o' me, ask about, I says. Any seaman could tell you 'tis true. I'm advising you against my own profit, but why I do so is my own concern. Not altogether, he says. It's some of mine. You saved me £30, Master Daw, and you've given me good arguments to use against a wilful woman that wants my fine new ship for her own toy. We'll not have any scroll work. His face shined with pure joy. Then see that the £30 you saved on it are honestly paid the king, I says, and keep clear of women folk. I gathered up my draft and crumpled it under my arm. If that's all you need of me, I'll be gone. I'm just looking across at the subtitles. They're actually a lot more accurate than I expected them to be with the accent. I'll be gone, I says, for I'm pressed. He turns him round and fumbles in a corner. Too pressed to be made a knight, Sir Harry, he says, and comes at me smiling with his three quarters of a rusty sword. I think I need to give you a picture here, actually. I'm just bringing it up. That one. And I shall move my chair so you shall see. There you go. Too pressed to be made a knight, Sir Harry, he says, and comes at me smiling with three quarters of a rusty sword. I pledge you my mark, I never guessed it was the king till that moment. I kneeled and he tapped me on the shoulder. Rise up, Sir Harry Daw, he says, and in the same breath, I'm pressed too, and slips through the tapestries, leaving me like a stuck calf. There he is. So there's the king who Harry Dawes hadn't realised was the king, knighting There's the sword. He's holding it out and he's going to tap him on the shoulder. And there's the man's hat on the floor. He's taken it off for what he's doing. There you go. Right, and we shall carry on with the next part of the story. Yes, we shall. It came over me in a bitter wave like that here was I, a master craftsman who had worked no bounds, soul or body, to make the king's tomb and chapel a triumph and a glory for all time, and here, d'ye see, I was made knight, not for anything I'd slaved over or given my heart and guts to, but expressly because I'd saved him £30 and a tongue lashing from Catherine of Castile, she that had asked for the ship. That thought shrivelled me with insides while I was folding away my draft. On the heels of it, maybe you'll see why. I began to grin to myself. I thought of the earnest simplicity of the man, the king, I should say, because I'd saved him the money. His smile as though he'd won half France. I thought of my own silly pride and foolish expectations that some day he'd honour me as a master craftsman. I thought of the broken-tipped sword he'd found behind the hangings, the dirt of the cold broom, and his cold eye wrapped up in his own concerns, scarcely resting on me. Then I remembered the solemn chapel roof and the bronzes about the stately tomb he'd lie in, and, you see, the unreason of it all, the mad high humour of it all, took hold on me, till I sat down on a dark stairhead in a passage, at the top of the stairs in a passage, in the dark, and laughed till I could laugh no more. What else could I have done? I never heard his feet behind me. He always walked like a cat, but his arm slid round my neck, pulling me back where I sat, till my head lay on his chest and his left hand held the knife plumb over my heart. Benedetto. Even so I laughed. The fit was beyond my holding. Laughed while he ground his teeth in my ear. He was stark crazed for the time. Laugh, he said. Finish the laughter. I'll not cut ye short. Tell me now. He wrenched at my head. Why'd the king choose to honour you? You lick-spittle Englishman. I'm full of patience now. I've waited so long. Then he was off at score about his Jonah and Bury Refectory and what I'd said of it, and his pictures in the chapel which all men praised and none looked at twice, as if that was my fault. And a whole parcel of words and looks treasured up against me through the years. Ease off your arm a little, I said. I cannot die by choking, for I am just dubbed knight, Benedetto. Tell me, and I'll confess ye, Sir Harry Daw, knight. There's a long night before ye. Tell, says he. So I told him, his chin on my crown, top of my head, told him all, told it as well and with as many words as I have ever told a tale at a supper with Torrigiano. I knew Benedetto would understand, for, mad or sad, he was a craftsman. I believed it to be the last tale I'd ever tell top mortal earth, and I would not put out bad work before I left the lodge. In other words, he's going to tell the tale as well as he can, because it's the last thing he's going to tell anyone. All art's one art, as I said. I bore Benedetto no malice. My spirits, d'ye see, were catched up in a high, solemn exultation, and I saw all earth's vanities foreshortened and little laid out below me like a town from a cathedral scaffolding. I told him what befell and what I thought of it. I gave him the king's very voice at "Master Daw, you saved me £30," his peevish grunt while he looked for the sword, and how the badger-eyed figures of glory and victory leered at me from the Flemish hangings. Body o' me, 'twas a fine noble tale, and as I thought, my last work on earth. That is how I was honoured by the king, I said. They'll hang ye for killing me, Benedetto, and since you've killed in the king's palace, they'll draw and quarter you too. But you're too mad to care. Grant me, though, you've never heard a better tale. He said nothing, but I felt him shake. My head on his chest shook. His right arm fell away, his left dropped the knife, and he leaned with both hands on my shoulder, shaking. I turned me round. No need to put my foot on his knife. The man was speechless with laughter. Honest craftsman's mirth. The first time I'd ever seen him laugh. You know the mirth that cuts off the very breath while ye stamp and snatch at the short ribs? That was Benedetto's case. When he began to roar and bay and hoop in the passage, I hailed him out into the street, and there we leaned against the wall and had it all over again, waving our hands and wagging our heads till the watch came to know if we were drunk. Benedetto says to him, solemn as an owl, "You have saved me £30, Master Daw," and off he peeled. In some sort we were mad drunk. I, because dear life had been given back to me, and he because, as he said afterwards, because the old crust of hatred round his heart was broke up and carried away by laughter. His very face had changed too. "Hal," he cries, "I forgive thee. Forgive me too, Hal. Oh, you English. Did it gall thee, Hal, to see the rust on the dirty sword? Tell me again, Hal, how the king grunted with joy. Oh, let us tell the master." So we reeled back to the chapel, arms round each other's necks, and when we could speak, he thought we'd been fighting, we told the master. Yes, we told Rudyard, and he laughed till he rolled on the new cold pavement. Then he knocked our heads together. "Ah, you English," he cried, "you are more than pigs, you are English. Now you are well punished for your dirty fishes. Put the draught in the fire and never do so any more. You are a fool, Hal, and you are a fool, Benedetto, but I need your works to please this beautiful English king." "And I meant to kill Hal," said Benedetto. "Master, I meant to kill him because the English king had made him a knight." "Ah," says the master, shaking his finger, "Benedetto, if you had killed my Hal, I should have killed you in the cloister. But you are a craftsman too, so I should have killed you like a craftsman. Very, very slowly. In an hour, if I could spare the time." That was Rudyard, the master. Mr. Springett sat quite still for some time after Hal had finished. And then he turned dark red. Then he rocked to and fro. Then he coughed and wheezed till tears ran down his face. Dan knew by this that he was laughing, but it surprised Hal at first. "Excuse me, sir," said Mr. Springett, "but I was thinking of some stables I built for a gentleman in 1874. They was stables in blue brick. Very particular work. Dunno as they weren't the best job whichever I'd done, but the gentleman's lady, she'd come from Lunnon, new married. She was all for building what she called a haw-haw, what you and me 'ud call a dyke, right across his park. A middlin' big job which I'd have had the contract for she spoke to me in the library about it, but I told her there was a line of springs just where she wanted to dig her ditch, and she'd flood the park if she went on." "Were there any springs at all?" said Hal. "Bound to be springs everywhere if you dig deep enough, ain't there? But what I said about the springs put her out of conceit of digging haw-haws, and she took and built a white-tiled dairy instead. But when I sent my last bill for the stables, the gentleman, he paid it without even looking at it, and I haven't forgotten nothing, I do assure you. More than that, he slips 2 £5 notes into my hand in the library, and 'Ralph,' he says, he allers calls me by name, 'Ralph,' he says, 'you've saved me a heap of expense and trouble this autumn.' I didn't say nothing, of course. I knowed he didn't want any haw-haws dug across his park no more'n I did, but I never said nothing. No more he didn't say nothing about my blue brick stables, which was really the best and honestest piece of work I'd done in quite a while. He gave me £10 for saving him a hem of a deal of trouble at home. I reckon things are pretty much alike all times and all places." Hal and he laughed together. Dan couldn't quite understand what they thought so funny, and went on with his work for some time without speaking. When he looked up, Mr. Springett, alone, was wiping his eyes with his green and yellow pocket handkerchief. "Bless me, Master Dan, I've been asleep," he said, "and I've dreamed a dream which has made me laugh. Laugh as I ain't laughed in a long day. I can't remember what 'twas all about, but they do say when old men take to laughing in their sleep, they're middlin' ripe for the next world. Have you been working honest, Master Dan?" "Rather," said Dan, unclamping the schooner from the vice, "and look how I've cut myself with a small gouge." "Yes, you want a lump of cobwebs to that," said Mr. Springer. "Oh, I see you've put it on already. That's right, Master Dan." And that's the end of that text chapter. Now we have a poem for the end of the chapter. Henry VII and the Shipwrights. Harry our king in England from London town is gone, and comen to Hamel on the Hoke in the county of Southampton. Not sure what those places are. Comen to Hamel, Hamull, on the Hoke. For there lay the Mary of the Tower, his ship of war so strong, and he would discover certainly if his shipwrights did him wrong. He told not none of his setting forth, nor yet where he would go, but only my Lord of Arundel, and meanly did he show, in an old jerkin and patched hose, that no man might him mark. With his frieze hood and cloak about, he looked like any clerk. So the king dressed as an ordinary person. He was at Hamel on the Hoke about the hour of the tide, and saw the Mary hailed into dock, the winter to abide, with all her tackle and habiliments, which are the king his own, but then ran on his false shipwrights, and stripped her to the bone. They heaved the mainmast overboard, that was of a trusty tree, and they wrote down it was spent and lost by force of weather at sea. But they sawn it into planks and strakes as far as it might go, to make in beds for their own wives and their little children also. There was a name called Slingawai. He crope beneath the deck, that's crept beneath the deck, crying, "Good fellows, come and see, the ship is nigh a wreck. For the storm that took our tall mainmast, it blew so fierce and fell. Alack, it hath taken the kettles and pans, and this brass pot as well." So they're stealing all the king's things off his ship and making claim that there's something that caused it, so that they can make some money out of it and profit just by having the things themselves. With that he set the pot on his head and hied him up the hatch, while all the shipwrights ran below to find what they might snatch, all except Bob Brigandine, and he was a yeoman good. He caught Slingawai round the waist and threw him on to the mud. "I have taken plank and rope and nail, without the king his leave, after the custom of Portsmouth, but I will not suffer a thief. Nay, never lift up thy hand at me. There's no clean hands in the trade. Steal and measure," quote Brigandine. "There's measure in all things made." "Gramercy, yeoman," said our king, "thy counsel liketh me," and he pulled a whistle out of his neck and whistled whistles 3. Then came my Lord of Arundel, pricking across the down, and behind him the mayor and burgesses of merry Southampton town. They drew the naughty shipwrights up with kettles in their hands, and bound them round the forecastle to wait the king's commands. "But since ye have made your beds," said the king, "ye needs must lie thereon, for the sake of your wives and little ones. Fellows, get you gone." When they had beaten Slingawai out of his own lips, our king appointed Brigandine to be clerk of all his ships. "Nay, never lift up thy hands to me. There's no clean hands in the trade. But steal and measure," said Harry our king, "there's measure in all things made." God speed the Mary of the Tower, the sovereign and grace due, the sweepstakes and the Mary Fortune, and the Henry of Bristol too. That's 6 ships' names he's just given us. "All tall ships that sail on the sea or in our harbours stand, that they may keep measure with Harry our king, and peace in England." There you go. That's an odd little poem for you about shipwrights profiting. So the king actually was saying that you can make a little profit along the way when you're building and doing the work for me, but don't just outright steal. No, just mark things up a little bit. At least that's what it made sense to me. Hi Roosters, how are you? Good to see you. Great to have you here. And unfortunately for you, I'm just about to finish. I hope you've been here for a little bit longer than just now. Yeah, I've just about finished because it's nearly 5 o'clock, 1 minute to 5 o'clock. So I'm hungry. Anyway, so that's the end of today's reading. And oh, good. I'm glad you haven't missed it all. That's good. Hi Yuki, good to see you. So when we carry on, we're going to be the next section is Mark Lake Witches. I'm just trying to find what this one was called. The previous section was, I think, called Gloriana, and we had that lady who was supposedly the queen. Come on, go to the page. The next section is called Mark Lake Witches, and it starts with a poem called The Way Through the Woods. But I'm not going to read that now. Okay? So, great to have you here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed it, even if it has been a little bit weird. And sorry about mangling all those accent bits and trying to make it so it was understandable, or trying to at least understand it. I'm not very good with that sort of thing. I realised after I'd started with these two chaps that they basically had their same accent, and the only way I could distinguish between the two of them was to have one of them at a higher pitch than the other. So anyway, we learn, we get there, it's entertaining, and that's what this is all for, isn't it? Anyway, so all the best to you. Have a great week ahead of you, and we'll see you next time. I'll be here in 2 days' time reading some more. And if you're watching this as a recording, try to catch it live. It's a bit more fun because I'll ask you questions. I'll ask you to look things up. And if you do look things up and type them into the chat, I will actually be able to then add that into the little bit of information that I have been sharing already. So anyway, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.